So the first question I have is if you could state your name, date of birth, and where you were born.
Clarence F. Taylor. I was born May the 1st, 1933 in Urbana, Ohio.
And how many children were in the family, and where did you end up in the lineup?
There were two, an older brother and myself.
All right. And if you could describe the community you grew up in?
I grew up in I guess you'd have to call it a family community. My grandfather was a somewhat wealthy man, so he also did construction, but he had a tent and awning manufacturing business. But he also did construction on the side. So he had bought property and he built houses, and he built them all in the same plot. So there was a community, and the main street in the community was called Johnson Drive because his name was Johnson.
All right. What did you like to do in your spare time?
My spare time, I modeled. I had clay, and I spent all of my spare time modeling with clay. And I did that every chance I got.
What did you want to be when you grew up?
I had no clear idea really what I wanted to be. I have to say I had no real aspirations to be anything in particular.
Did you have a job as a teenager? If so, what was it?
Yes, I worked at various jobs taking care of lawns and all. And then my aunt, who worked as a sales lady in a dress shop, got me a job working in the evenings cleaning up the dress shop after it was closed. And I worked at that job until I graduated from high school.
What family traditions did you establish?
Family traditions that I established. That's a good question. The main thing, family tradition we had a very close-knit family. It was a matriarchal family. My grandmother was, my grandfather and grandmother stayed married continuously. There was no separation. But my grandfather made the money and my grandmother ran the house. And the family tradition was that all the family had to pitch in and do different chores. And the family was very close-knit. The older kids took care of the younger kids. So I guess the only family tradition would be the older kids taking care of the younger kids.
Does your family have heirlooms or objects of sentimental value? If so, what is their origin and how have they been passed down?
Yes, we do. The items of sentimental value were passed on from family to family. And these items usually wound up in a room we called the parlor. And the parlor was the living room in the house that no one ever lived in. The only time anyone went in the parlor was if the priest or the pastor was to come by on a visit, then he would be entertained in the parlor. Otherwise, the parlor was kept spotlessly clean, and all of our family heirlooms, pictures, furniture, everything that dated back to earlier members of the family were all accumulated in that parlor.
How would you have said the world has changed since you were younger?
Oh, dramatically. When I was younger, everything was much closer. The family was close. As I grew up, I had an uncle living on each corner of the street, and we used to play four corners in the middle of the street. But I had an uncle living on each one of those corners. And the nice thing about it is we live very close to the fairgrounds. Urbana, Ohio is a little town, and like most little towns in Ohio, we had a fairgrounds. And we lived within walking distance of the fairgrounds. So for entertainment, we would go over to the fairgrounds and go through the barns and walk through the fields. It was a completely different time because we could do that and never was there any concern about our welfare. Strange as it may seem today, 7, 8, 9-year-old kids could wander miles away from the house with no fear of anything ever happening to them. I guess the main thing that's changed is the safety factor. Things were much more safe in those days.
How was your family affected by the Great Depression?
My mother and father were married during the Great Depression. And my dad, who was a very independent man, he was working at whatever jobs he could find. Now, obviously, since my grandfather was a businessman, he did do some work for my grandfather, but he was too proud to think that his wife's father was supporting him. So he would do any job he could find that made money during the Depression. And he often told the story, which we listened to often, about he would get up on a cold winter's day and hike out to a field and shuck corn to make money. That always stuck in my mind. I always saw I'd never shuck corn in the middle of the winter.
Did you or anyone close to you serve in the war? And how do you remember this experience?
I served in 2 wars. When I graduated from high school, I went in the Air Force. And I served in Korea. And later I served in Vietnam. And what was the follow-on question?
How do you remember this experience?
I remember it dramatically. I remember my first night in Korea. We landed in Seoul, and they put us on the back of a 6x truck, which was a big truck with a canvas cover over the back. And it had 2 drive wheels in the front and 4 drive wheels in the rear. And we drove down a muddy road from Seoul to Suwon. And I remember thinking, this is not going to be a lot of fun. And I was right. It never did turn out to be a lot of fun. And I'll never forget the first night that I had to go on guard duty. The sergeant at arms brought us in. He gave us each a carbine and a flashlight and sheep shearling clothing, much the way the old bomber crews wore, the sheep shearling pants and jacket and the hat with the big earmuffs that came down around you. And he said, okay, you go out and you walk this post, and if you hear somebody, turn on the flashlight and identify them. So I went out on my post, and I got out there. They let me out of the vehicle, and they drove off, and it was pitch black. And I'd always heard it being dark enough to see your hand in front of your face. And out of curiosity, I held my hand up in front of my face, and so I was shocked to see, or not see, I was shocked that I could not see my hand in front of my face. It was so dark. And I made a vow at that very second, if someone came down that road, they'd get shot. There was no way I was going to turn a flashlight on out there and identify to the enemy where I was with that light.
Do you remember your first contact with significant inventions like the TV, radio, and computer?
Yes, I remember the radio. My uncle was very much committed to music, and he had a huge radio phonograph combination, and we used to sit for hours and listen to him play his records, and it was, we'd make like an evening of it. We'd go over to his house and listen to his records till it was bedtime, and then we'd come back home and go to sleep. And then early on, one of our neighbors got a TV, and it had a screen about that big, and they had a magnified, like a big magnifying glass that sat in front of it, and you looked at the magnifying glass, and it blew the picture up to roughly about 10 inches. And that was my first experience of that wondrous adventure, or invention, I should say, that wondrous invention, the television.
Thank you, Poppy.
You're quite welcome.